This video is about Maimonides' view of social justice and tzedakah and charity. Now, it's in the section of his book of seeds in the Mishnah Torah. Now, seeds is volume 7, and you'll say, what does gifts to the poor have to do with seeds? Well, in the first couple of chapters of his gifts to the poor, he talks about the biblical basic sense of tzedakah, which is to give the poor the corners of your field. So that makes sense from that perspective. And he does say that the field owner gives to every poor man passing by his field some of the tithe, so that the poor man may eat their fill. And he quotes Deuteronomy saying, that may eat their fill in your settlements. And of course, he stresses the very important Jewish principle of helping the needy. The Torah commands us to give charity to the poor. He's quoting Deuteronomy 15:8, you must open your hand to him. You shall maintain him, from Leviticus 25. Let your brother live beside you, in Leviticus 25:36. Then he says, if anybody notices a poor man asking for something and ignores him, and fails to give tzedakah, you've broken a commandment against hardening your heart, in Deuteronomy 15:7. He says you must give the poor anything he needs. Now the Hebrew is lafi ma shechaserani, that he's missing, atam mitzuvah litain lo. So there's a big debate in the society about what exactly somebody's missing. What do they have to have? Now you're obligated to give them more than they have. Though you are commanded to relieve his needs, again his needs, what's chaser, you are not obligated to make him rich. And then he says that the non-Jewish poor should be maintained alongside the Jewish poor for the sake of peaceful relations. And then the idea of charity begins at home comes from here. He says in the number 13, a poor man's relative has priority over any person. A poor in his own household has priority over the poor in his town. The poor in his town have priority over the poor of another town. So he says all that. He says we must observe the precept of tzedakah more carefully than any other commandment, because tzedakah is the characteristic of an upright person. No one ever became poor by giving tzedakah. You should give cheerfully and gladly. And I have another video which goes through his 8 steps of giving tzedakah, which is found in this section, chapter 10 of the Gifts to the Poor. However, the main thing that I wanted to offer here in a cultural debate in our society about the extent and breadth of our welfare state and the growing entitlements and how that's bankrupting America, he says the following: one should ever patiently strive not to be dependent on other people and not be a public charge. So the sages have enjoined us, rather make your Sabbath a weekday meal, in other words limited, rather than be dependent on men. If reduced to poverty, even a distinguished scholar must not disdain manual work, no matter how unworthy it is, in order to avoid dependence on others. The sages have commanded us. In fact, some of the great sages derive their livelihood from manual labor. And he said they asked no help of the community, neither would they have accepted charity had it been offered. That's the characteristic. You should not be dependent. You should do anything but be dependent. And he goes on to say, if anyone is not in need of relief and yet receives it by deceiving the public, he will not die of old age before becoming a public charge. A curse on him. In fact, he quotes Jeremiah 17:5, a curse on him who relies on man. But if you're vitally in need, you should collect. But I think the main point here is about the obligation to strive not to be dependent on others. And we have such a culture now where half of America doesn't pay any income tax. So half of America is now subsidizing the other half. And you can't tell me that half of America can't contribute at all to America. And these growing dependent entitlement programs which have no means test. So how do we know that people actually need it? We don't. And Maimonides says you should only give it to them if they need it. It's chaserlo, but maybe some of these people can afford it on their own, or maybe there's other ways. So I thought that Maimonides' wisdom from 1,000 years ago would certainly be helpful in our debate today, that tzedakah is a very important mitzvah. You should not turn away from tzedakah. We have obligations to help the needy, but the needy should strive very hard to not be dependent, and we should make sure that we are giving them only what they need. That, I think, has an important impact on the cultural discussion today about the extent of our welfare state.